Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good evening from here in New Hampshire, and greetings to anyone tuning in either live, whatever time it is where you are, or as you view this broadcast at a later date. My name is Peter Wickman, and I'm the Director of Admission and Financial Aid here at the White Mountain School. I'm so happy to give an introduction to this evening's A Closer Look presentation on student-driven inquiry and what that means for our students and teachers here at the White Mountain School. I am particularly grateful not only for those of you who are watching, but also to our amazing students and teachers whom you will meet shortly. Today, on December 16th, 2020, while this event is happening live, our students and faculty are on a much-deserved winter break. While we were incredibly fortunate to bring the majority of our students back to campus for in-person and hybrid classes this fall, it was different. It had to be different so our community could be safe. Students, faculty, and staff did amazingly hard and meaningful work in spite of the challenges of social distancing and limited access to our amazing local area. The first line of the White Mountain School's mission statement is that we are a school of inquiry and engagement. Through the challenges of transitioning to emergency remote learning in the spring, and then returning to campus this fall for a semester that we all knew would be quite different, our community has been flexible, humble, courageous, trusting, and compassionate as they continued to demonstrate a commitment to inquiry and engagement. I share that because, first of all, they're deserving of that praise. And also, I need to thank them for taking the time out of their break to share the work that they have done with you tonight. So now, tonight is about getting a closer look at one aspect of the White Mountain School experience, student-driven inquiry. Whether you are well on your way through your application or just getting started, this will provide you with some examples of the work that we do here. Please do utilize the comment function to ask questions as they come up. I will be able to ask them to our presenters at the end or type answers as the presentation is happening. Now I'll turn it over to Mike Peller, our Assistant Head of School for Teaching and Learning, to introduce a few students and teachers. Mike, give me one moment and I will pull you in.
Thank you for the introduction, Peter, and so excited to be here and so excited to share with everyone a little bit about student-driven inquiry at the White Mountain School. The framework of this conversation will be, it's sort of a three-part conversation. First, we're going to hear from some students. I think it's really important to begin with students because they are at the center of our learning. You're going to hear from three amazing students, Addie and Oliver, and hopefully Christine. Great, Christine is here now. And I've asked each of these three students to think of one exciting opportunity that really captures student-driven inquiry that comes from this past fall. A fall that has been really unique in terms of learning, but we feel so grateful to have been able to do so largely in person with some exciting classes and amazing student projects to show for that. So we'll start with students so you can hear from the student experience. Then I'll give a short overview about why student-driven inquiry. What's the theory behind it? Why is it so important to the school? Why is it so important for schools at large? And then I'm going to turn it over to Matthew and Sam, two of our most exciting, innovative teachers, for them to share some examples of student-driven inquiry in the classroom. So we'll start with students, I'll give an overview, and then you'll hear from some teachers, and then we'll end, ideally, because this is about inquiry, we'll end with some questions. So I will turn it over to the students. Addie, do you mind kicking us off? Give an example of student-driven inquiry. What was the class and what did you do?
So this semester I was in a history of disease class. Oh yeah, I'm Addie. I'm a sophomore, by the way. I was in a history of disease class, which was a really great class to take because of the pandemic that we're in right now. And we got to do mini lasers in that class where we had full choice of what disease we wanted to study. So I studied typhoid, but specifically typhoid Mary, because whenever I had heard the name typhoid Mary and I knew typhoid was a thing, and whenever I thought of typhoid, I thought of typhoid Mary, but I knew nothing about either. So in doing research about typhoid Mary, I also learned about the disease as a whole, and I also learned about the sexism going on at that time and why we only hear about typhoid Mary as a spreader of typhoid because she was a woman. And even though many men also were spreaders of typhoid, only the women, like household workers, got press and are known for spreading the disease, which was a really interesting thing to learn about. I made a children's book as my project. I actually have it. I drew the photos throughout it and wrote it. And so, yeah, that was a really great project where other people got to choose other things they wanted to study, but I chose typhoid.
Thanks, Addie. Oliver, how about you?
So this past semester, I took a class with Sam actually, and it was a design and entrepreneurship class. So basically, the whole class was designed around one final project that we were working on, which was creating a business that we would have in the local Bethlehem area, and we interviewed like lots of local business owners and stuff. And my project was creating a butcher shop that used locally sourced meats, and but it also imported like exotic hunted meats from all around the world to sell at this butcher shop. And what was really cool is that like everybody in the class had like completely different ideas, but it all still like worked well with what we were doing, and it was just a really cool class.
Thanks, Oliver. And Christine, how about for you?
Hi, I'm Christine. I'm a sophomore, and my project was for my English class. So we were studying global literature as a main piece, and I decided to make my mini laser based on artwork throughout the world. So mine was basically just on artwork throughout different time periods in the world all across the globe. And I studied different pieces from like Greece, this giant scroll from China, and hieroglyphics because they're just little images that represent words and letters. And I thought they were all pretty cool. I learned a lot about different history and different parts of the world and different reasons why certain pieces of art and like hieroglyphics, why they worked in some places and why they eventually lost their essence and why they stopped teaching that way. So I learned a lot about history and reading and art, and it was my favorite work throughout the whole year.
Thanks, Christine and Addie and Oliver. I think in each one of those examples, what you heard are students who are in a class that has some framework, but inside that framework have the opportunity to explore something that is interesting and important to them. And through that work is more meaningful, it's more transferable. I think, Christine, I wanted to end with you because I had the opportunity to sit with Christine's English 2 teacher at the end of the semester. And I sat down with her teacher and I said, you know, how are the student projects ending? And the teacher's eyes lit up. She had the hugest smile and she said, I want to tell you about them, and went through and told me about each student's project in detail. And in each project, first of all, that she knew all of them so clearly, knew exactly what they were working on, knew exactly sort of the question that the student was wrestling with, and that each question that the students were wrestling with were so varied and different that captures the diversity and uniqueness of each kid is really important. So I want to talk now a little bit about sort of why student-driven inquiry. Those were 3 examples of it, but what is it and why? So I'm going to share my screen here. Students, can I get a thumbs up? Am I sharing my screen okay? Great, perfect. So couple years ago, I read this amazing New York Times article, and it was a critique on education. And the framework of the article was this: imagine if you took someone from New York City in the late 1800s, and you were to take them, remove them, and plop them into New York City right now. What would it be like for that person? It would be incredibly disorienting. That person would wonder, what are all these devices that are people walking around with? All of these cars buzzing by, some of them self-driving now, huge buildings, different fashions, industries that people are in that didn't exist in the late 1800s. The person would be so disoriented until you put them and drop them into a classroom, into most classrooms. What they would see would feel really familiar. And that's problematic because education really hasn't changed in a long time. I mean, look at these pictures. Over 100 years separates these photos. Students sitting passively in rows, consuming information that a teacher delivers, only to later have to spit that information back out in the form of a test. It's entirely transactional, and how uninspiring. No wonder most kids are bored in most schools. And what a disservice schools are doing for the students. Most schools are educating students for the previous century. They're not educating students for the world in which they will live and in the world in which they will lead. Schools at large, most schools, are doing the exact opposite of what students need. And quite frankly, they're working against what the world needs. This graph here is taken from Warren Berger's research on inquiry. Warren Berger found that student question asking, the tendency for human beings to ask questions, it peaks at age 5. That's when people are asking the most questions. I have a 5-year-old. It's true. They ask a ton. But then that question asking rapidly drops off. And while Berger's research was not causal, he points a finger at schools for this problem. Why? Because schools don't create space for joyful learning. Most schools don't. They don't create space for student-driven inquiry. Most schools celebrate the kid with the answer and think the kid with the question isn't really smart enough. And what a problem that is, because it's questions that open up new ways of thinking. It's questions that create innovation. It's questions that mobilize people around curiosity. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, for everyone that's watching this now, everyone on this call loves learning, or at least one time did. And if maybe right now you feel like your love of learning has dwindled some, I can tell you this: it just needs to be reignited. So what if schools created space and encouraged students to be that curious kid that they once were, to ask questions and to pursue answers about things that that student cared about, just like Oliver did in his entrepreneurship class, or Addie in the history of disease, or Christine in her English class? That's what we're doing here at the White Mountain School. And what's the result? The result is this: excited students doing meaningful work. The world needs curious and creative students. And how are most schools responding to the changing needs and expectations for a dynamically changing and globally connected world? Well, unfortunately, most are not. Schools are not developing the flexible and nimble thinkers that the world so clearly needs. We need students to ask new questions, to solve challenging problems. Think of all the problems in front of us right now that are new this year. We need students who have developed resiliency and reflection as tools for learning. We need students who can collaborate meaningfully and who, through practice, understand the power of curiosity. So why student-driven inquiry? For so many reasons, but primarily because we need students who have the habits and skills to engage in a world that's changing faster than ever before. This image here is taken from an article by the World Economic Forum, and it highlights the amount of work that will become automated in the next 5 years. In many ways, it's a call to action for us, especially in education, to think about how do we best prepare students for this changing world. Why I added this picture, though, is I received an email from a parent, and in the email from a parent was this article. And the email from the parent said this, quote, the parent said, I was watching a fascinating report on BBC over the weekend that made me think of the White Mountain School. They highlighted how the traditional educational systems are ill-equipped or not designed to hone many of the skills that will be imperative to recuperate post-COVID, like problem solving or emotional intelligence or resiliency. Here, and this is the parent continuing to write, here's where I immediately thought of WMS. I think it supports This article supports the WMS pedagogy and substantiates its work. End of quote. That was what the parent wrote to me. That email, it made my day. It put me in the best mood because it's one example of many of our students and families realizing that we're preparing students to lead lives of curiosity, courage, and compassion. Okay, so now enter 2020. This is, and I know it's cliche to say, a year like no other. A pandemic, a reckoning on race, political turmoil, schools shut down in-person learning, and for the first time since our current educational model's inception in the 1800s, schools and school leaders had to begin to reevaluate and innovate. Schools are asking really important questions like, how do we prioritize student wellness? Why was that not being asked before? How do we embed anti-bias work throughout all of our programs? What's the role of standardized tests? How is the college process evolving? And what's the role of grades and what are they for? These are all important questions. These are important questions that we've been asking for years. Other schools are needing to reevaluate their entire framework for working with kids, or to use business jargon, they're having to reevaluate their value proposition. However, as I mentioned, a few schools like us have been doing this work, the important work of educating the whole student by using inquiry as the driving force, and we're experienced and ready to educate students for this rapidly changing future. Rather than simply preparing students to get into a good college, which we also do, more importantly, we're committed and succeeding in preparing students to be civically engaged. Isn't that what communities need right now and will need moving forward? So how do we do this? We successfully educate the whole child through the most natural form of learning, curiosity. When conditions are created, like the ones that Oliver and Addie and Christine described, when these conditions are created in a classroom that inspire student questions, engagement naturally follows. And the learning, which is driven by student inquiry, it matters. You heard that in their voice. It matters to the students, it matters to the community, and quite frankly, it matters to the world. And we're able to do this work by focusing on what matters, which is our essential skills and habits. These are the skills and habits that allow for successful learning in any discipline, in any industry, given any problem that needs to be solved. We are preparing kids to look around, to identify questions, to do research so as to see what others have already said on the topic, and then to develop their own model or thesis, to receive feedback and then to collaborate with others, and then most importantly, to communicate that idea broadly to others with conviction. Of course, we do teach content, but we see content really as the catalyst for sparking student curiosity. It's the catalyst for driving students' questions and then their pursuits of answers to these questions. And at the heart of our learning program is choice at every level. From the classes students choose, to the projects that they engage in within those chosen classes, to the ways in which and the work in which they choose to be assessed. When choice and agency is at the core of a school, it allows for authentic, student-centered learning. Consider the choice you'll have. For example, rather than a year-long survey of US history, we let students do deep dives in thematic semester electives. Examples include the 1619 Project, Natural Disasters and Humanitarianism, the Presidency, the Supreme Court, 20th Century Foreign Affairs. Look at these courses. They are so relevant right now. And we're drawing on all of the conversations from history and present to give context to students. Or think about this diverse range of electives, a few of them shown here in the slide. You can learn the skills of an entrepreneur, as Oliver mentioned. You can use fiction writing as a way to identify and solve global problems. You can compose an original piece of classical music and work one-on-one with a professional musician, or dive into the important literature on the environment, grapple with the ethics of food. You can and will get your hands deep in soil with a hands-on approach to sustainable farming, or read the beatnik authors who railed against conformity, or learn how to provide care to others in the backcountry, or design, program, build, and control a robot, or engage in self-directed scientific research. And if our electives are not enough, choose from one of the many amazing global online academy courses. We're a member of this consortium of just over 100 schools from all over the world, and it's a unique opportunity to learn in this fashion. And we feel fortunate to be the only school in Northern New England to be a consortium member. But I could talk forever about student-driven inquiry at the why and the how, the theory behind it. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to turn it over to our teachers now so that they can show you what this actually looks like in the classes. So I'll turn this over to Sam at this point.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam, and I am one of the mathematics and robotics teachers here at the White Mountain School. I'm going to share a little bit about what inquiry looks like in practice in the 3 courses I taught this fall: Design Entrepreneurship, Intro to Robotics, and Statistics. Like Mike, I could probably talk for a very long time about the amazing work that my students did in any of these 3 courses. So I'm going to try and move quickly through them and hopefully focus in on some key projects and points. The first class I wanted to talk about is Design Entrepreneurship, which is the course that Oliver spoke about. This was a new course this year, and as Oliver mentioned, it was student-driven from the very beginning, right? With students choosing the type of business they wanted to create, and then doing the work to make that happen. I wanted to focus in on one particular part of that process, which was interviews that we did with local business owners. We were able to set up 4 remote interviews with different business owners, from the local candy shop owner to the climbing gym owner. And in each of these interviews, students were in the driver's seat. Next slide, Mike. As we prepared for these, students would create a shared Google Doc, and they would each get a single slide to brainstorm as many questions as they could come up with that they wanted to ask that entrepreneur. You can see one student slide in the center there and all the others on the left. Then they would go through and highlight questions from other students that they thought were really compelling. All of that would then be pared down to a final question list. In this case, the students broke it up into a series of questions on branding and marketing, which was the topic we were looking at that week, and then a series of other questions that they were interested in as well. And then when we got into the interview, it was entirely student run. So other than kind of, inviting the entrepreneur and saying hi, I was able to sit back and kind of watch, listen, and learn as students asked the questions, asked follow-up questions, took notes on what they were learning, and really got a chance to interact with these folks in the community. After each interview, students would write reflections on what they had learned from the interview and how it might apply to the new business idea that they were in the process of developing. So that's one kind of like section from that class. The second class I wanted to talk about is the other elective I taught this fall, which was Introduction to Robotics. Again, in this course, student choice and inquiry were a part of every project. The general way it worked is students would be given a challenge, in this case, creating a robot that could run a 6-foot course in under 1 second. And then they were tasked with creating their own solution to that problem from a huge kit of robotics materials. So as you can see, the designs ran the gamut, both the physical designs that students came up with and also the code that they used to implement their racer program. Although all the designs were different, every student was implementing things that they had learned on gear ratios, on conditional statements, loops, sensors, right? But doing it in all unique and different ways. It's also worth noting, right, these were the end result of an iterative process for students. So they often would find that like the first idea did not work as well as they thought it would, and would have to go back to the drawing board to improve on it. When we got to the final project for the course, students were given choice not just over the solution that they came up with, but also the challenge that they wanted to tackle. We brainstormed possible tasks as a group. Students chose a challenge that they were interested in, and then set out to build a solution to it. And again, I wish I had videos or I tried to make animated GIFs of these so you could see them, but they were too big to be allowed in the PowerPoint, which was a shame. But I just want to talk briefly about these. So in the top left, that's a remote controlled car. So this student created, it's actually 2 robots. One talks to the other. It's using a gyroscopic sensor in the controller so that when she turned from left to right, that was the signal that would tell the robot to turn, along with buttons to make it move forward and backward, all communicated over Bluetooth that she had to program, again, using skills that we had touched on, but things that were kind of her creation. In the bottom left is an a really kind of creepy, crawly, insect-like walking robot that a student came up with. It moves, again, in a really like a Tim Burton-y way. No wheels or anything like that. And then on the right side, this student wanted to create a waiter robot that could be used at a restaurant. So he designed a claw, and again, programmed over Bluetooth where he can remote control it. It can actually pick up a cup, drive somewhere else with it, and then turn the cup to pour it out and bring it back. Really cool projects, and I was like genuinely blown away by the challenges my students selected and the designs they were able to come up with in this course. So that's all well and good, but inquiry doesn't just live in fun elective courses like entrepreneurship and robotics. It also needs to live in kind of like the core math classes as well. So the final class I wanted to talk about was my statistics class. And this gets back, I think, a lot to what Mike was saying. Statistics and math classes so often focus on teaching students how to answer questions that a teacher or a textbook provides for them. And that's important, but it skips over what is, I think, the most difficult skill there is when it comes to analyzing data in real life, which is knowing what questions to ask in the first place, right? How do you look at a data set and know, oh, this is what I can find out from it. These are the important things for me to analyze. That's the skill that I really want to focus on building with my students in this course. And practicing that skill means showing them real, relevant data sets. It means having them grapple with what they can learn from them. And it means embedding that in every project. So every project that we do includes some aspect of student choice. This is actually a project from the first week of the class where we were working on data visualization using real life data on US incarceration rates. As you can see, and it might be a little small on the screen there, there are a few kind of pre-selected visualizations that I have students do. But that fourth one, right, one additional graph of your choosing is a place for students to start building that habit of thinking like, well, what can I ask from this giant Excel spreadsheet, right? What kind of data can I get from it? As we move through the course, the amount of choice and the amount of time that students are spending coming up with the questions and not just answering the questions increases. So at the end, we'll kind of skip all the way to the end of the course. We do a final project. And for the final project, students had to design either an experiment or a survey on the topic of their own choosing, and then collect and analyze data and write up a report. And again, these are questions that they came up with. They had to decide on the way to collect the data. But I want to highlight a few of these just because I'm, again, really proud of all the work my students did this fall. So this student, Jennifer, decided to investigate student opinions of some of the schedule changes that were made at the school this year in response to COVID. So she designed a large survey for students and analyzed that data. Teal collected data on how many hours of sleep students were getting each night and what their daily screen time was. She summarized both sets of data. Don't look too hard at the sleep graph, parents. And surprise, found that more screen time does in fact correlate with less sleep. Carlene looked at student self-reported happiness and homework habits over a week. So she compared happiness levels among students who reported having completed all their homework and students who hadn't completed all their homework and found a stark difference. And lastly, Shiva and Matt were really interested in the idea of the political compass. So they created a survey to classify students in the 4 quadrants of the political compass. And then they analyzed students within each of those quadrants, how they felt about different aspects of school policy. In each of these cases, these projects were completely student driven. And again, it's important to note this was the end of our course. So we had spent a whole semester with students practicing the skill of coming up with questions, looking at data sets and figuring out what they can ask and building that. But students came up with these topics and questions. They designed the data collection methods. They analyzed and reported on the data. They used skills that we had been learning throughout the course. They were able to get feedback and guidance from me through the process, but these projects were truly their own. And I think talking to students at the end of the course about what stood out to them, what they were taking away, the final project is often mentioned as that thing that they're like, I did this from start to finish. I created this question and I answered it. So hopefully that gives you some idea of what student-driven inquiry looks like in practice, at least in my classes. I'm sorry if we had to rush it a little bit, but I'm gonna pass it off now to Matthew to talk about his English class.
There we go. Awesome. Thanks, Sam. My name is Matthew. I'm an English teacher. This is my first year at the White Mountain School, and I am absolutely loving everything about competency learning. And I'm going to tell you why. So one of the biggest things as a teacher that competency learning does is that it frees me up to allow students to bring in those more creative energies into the classroom. And so when designing my world building class, I sat down, I thought about the major competencies that I wanted my students to demonstrate their mastery of, right? And so it came down to three. It came down to critical thinking, in which they need to support an opinion on a topic. It came down to identifying life experiences that have influenced their opinions and assumptions on the world. And then a English competency skill, which is the English one you see there on the left, which is, can they articulate their position with a direct thesis statement or theme that drives the entire project. The biggest one for me was the CT5, right? If we're thinking about student engagement, we're thinking about student-centered learning, I really wanted students to figure out what was important to them, right? What world issues was affecting them right now, and try to think about, well, can I solve it, right? Like, how can I begin to think about solving this issue that seems so huge, but maybe it's not as huge as I think it is. And so I asked students to come in, and we generated a list of things that was important to them. And students picked everything from global warming to police brutality to anger and mental illness. There was a plethora of things. And then students got to create their own world over the course of 6 weeks that took these real world issues that they was passionate about and made a metaphorical world to highlight some of the bigger issues and smaller ones, because ultimately students had to try and fix the problem that they created, right? And so the example on the left that you see is from a student who came into the class and was like, listen, I'm super creative, Matthew. That's not my issue. And I know what I want to talk about, right? Like, I want to talk about police brutality and I want to talk about war, but I just can't put it into words. Like, I have the images in my head, but trying to translate them isn't working. And so we sat there and I said, well, what other skill sets do you have? And they said, well, I can draw. And I said, bingo, there we go. Right? If you can draw and you can encapsulate the idea of war and anger and police brutality in your drawings, that would be perfect, right? Because you're still meeting the competencies that I'm asking you to do, right? Because ultimately, I want to see if you can make an argument and persuade me. And if your drawings can do that, then I'm okay. And so she brought in some drawings, and as you can see, this is the artwork that she created. She created these bat weasel-like creatures that were supposed to be tall and menacing with pointy ears and are gigantic. And she was like, I wanted them to be like almost like giants, right? Like when you looked at them, you was terrified, and they terrified everybody. And so when she put them to scale with humans, I was like, oh my gosh, right? Like I can see this fear just eluding off of these creatures. And so that was one way in which the competencies was able to help this student talk about what she wanted to talk about and demonstrate her mastery of this just outside of the written word. And then on the right, what you'll see is an example of something that came from a project menu. And Mike, you can go to the next slide. What project menus do is it gives students choice. And so in one of my classes, what I decided to do was I wanted students to pick and choose what assignments that they were going to do to demonstrate their understanding of the text that we was reading, right? Because I recognized that I had a plethora of different interests in my class. I had people who love music, dance, video game, Twitter, Minecraft, you name it, right? Students loved everything, and they wanted to bring that in. And so I was like, all right, so how can we do this, but also allow for me to make sure that you're growing as an English student and that you're understanding the material and grappling with our essential questions. And so we put this project menu together. And so what you'll notice is that there are different options that students can choose from to demonstrate their understanding of the text that we're looking at. So anything ranges from writing an introductory paragraph with the thesis that makes a strong claim. So something more traditional for students who might not see themselves as creative. But then you got the creative options, right? Create a collage that tries to express the same emotion, right? And then write 2 paragraphs explaining your choices, right? So why did you put that sun on top of that bunny rabbit, right? Like, what was that expressing in that moment? And so really having them use some of those more critical and critical thinking skills. And what you'll notice that each option has a competency attached to it. And so what this allows me to do as a teacher, it allows me to go, hey, Mike, all right, so I noticed that you've only focused on your CT3s for a while and you're excelling in them. But the last time you did a CT5, you didn't do so well, right? Maybe we could work on that competency. Maybe you could find an option that will help you develop that critical thinking skill set that we're looking at. So while these project menus give so much choice, it also helps students see the competencies that they're working on so they can track their growth from week to week and have the agency to say, well, I'm doing really good in this one thing. Maybe I'll push myself in this other thing. Or I didn't do so hot on that one last week. Maybe I'll do something that plays to my skill set and learn and reach out and see how I could develop that competency 3 and then go back to it next week. And I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Sam. I think the reason why Oliver and Addie and Christine are able to sort of have the space to explore the projects that they do is because as teachers, we have the confidence and the courage to open up our classrooms in ways that allow students to bring in their interests and their curiosities and to fuel that meaningful, excited learning. So thank you both. I want to just briefly return to that graph of question asking from Warren Berger's research and ask that question of, how might schools prevent the decline in question asking? An important question to ask. Well, at the White Mountain School, we do this by supporting questions. We do this by encouraging questions. We do this by building a school that's committed to questions. There's a great educational thinker, Chris Higgins, and he wrote the following. He said, after all, and this summarizes much of what we talked about, after all, the beauty of a question lies in its power to open up new worlds, new room to think, new room to breathe and move. A true question is dynamic, and thus a true love of questions must mean following the action, not parking in front of a shrine to pure questionhood. So that is precisely how we think of questions at the White Mountain School. From questions, we build models. From questions, we collaborate and construct arguments. We dive into research, we develop new ideas, and we share our findings broadly. Our work is relevant to the student and to the world, and the learning is driven by student questions. So on that, we would love to open this up and see if any of you have some questions for the students, the teachers, or for me. And thank you for being here.
Well, thank you all. I did have a couple questions come in through the Zoom application. And it's been a little while since we've heard our students talk. So I'll kick this first one over to you. And I'd actually love for all 3 of you to take a crack at it. First, maybe Christine, and then Oliver, and then Addie. So the question is, was it hard to transition to this new kind of learning, this new kind of education in school?
So I can go first. For me, it wasn't really hard because I've always been the person who, whenever she asks questions, she needs to go and find the answer, whether it's during class or outside of class, because I just really want to know because I'm a curious person. So for me, it wasn't a challenge to try to transition from a school where it's more orientated towards you have to answer specific questions to choose your own questions and answer those. And it was just a nice relief to have a change of scenery to something that I can really appreciate and actually learn to love what I want to learn to love about. So it was really nice.
For me, I came to this school from a public school environment where you're really almost like encouraged to not ask questions. Um, and coming here, it's the exact opposite. Like, you basically have to ask questions. And like if you're like a shy person, like I was like a little like shy coming in, like I didn't always want to like ask questions in class, but you don't really have a choice. So I would say that the transition was like pretty relieving actually, because like once you get like in the groove, it's really nice and you start to really enjoy learning.
I came here from a Montessori school that taught very similar to this school. So I had sort of already been in the mindset of asking questions for a while. And so it wasn't much of a transition at all for me.
Thanks so much. This is a great question for Matthew and Sam. It's in the same vein. It's how do teachers support students to transition to a new kind of learning?
Sorry, I can jump in first, and then I'll pass it over to Matthew. I think some of it is kind of intentionally scaffolding that skill of inquiry, right? Like as natural as that is for students when they're young, by the time students have come through high school, if they're coming through a more traditional educational system, it's really hard to come up with your own questions. And so I talked about this a little bit in my stats work, but I try really hard to kind of build that skill slowly. And the more time students get that, the more at-bats they have with trying that skill, the more comfortable it becomes, the easier it becomes. And you see a really amazing progression over a student's career at a school like this in terms of kind of how proficient they can get in inquiry. Yeah.
I would say one of the things that I love to do, and at first it's kind of drawing the students, but once they're in it, they understand, is to provide safe spaces for them to make mistakes and fail. And I think that's the biggest thing, right? And Oliver can attest to this in the world building class. We had a unit where we was trying to test out our real world issues. And I was like, go big, right? Like imagine as if tomorrow you can implement this best world scenario, go. And we had some big ideas and we voted as a class and we would pass them, right? If we thought they was equitable, if we thought they were sustainable, if they thought they was something that was doable and we would want to do. And what we found was after 5 students presenting, none of them got passed. And students were like, wait, something's not right here, Matthew. And I was like, so let's take a pause and let's talk about this, right? I asked you to go big and you did. Just because your ideas have not been passed, that doesn't mean you did a bad job, right? It's just an opportunity for you to slow down, look at the work that you've done in the past, think about this moment that you're doing right now, and see if you can change or tweak something based off of the feedback that you're getting so that when you go into your final, right, you'll be producing amazing quality work. And that's what happened. And so I think for me, providing some of those safe spaces for students to make mistakes and figure out what inquiry and student-centered learning is until they get comfortable with
it. Hey, thanks so much, Matthew and Sam. Those are great examples. This last question is just teed up for you, Mike. So here it is. What impact does this style of learning have on standardized testing or college applications? How does this look when students are graduating from the White Mountain School?
You're muted.
I'm unmuted now. It's my first time on Zoom. Seems to be going okay, I hope. We spent a long time before really diving deeply in terms of our program and with our focus on inquiry. We spent a lot of time going around and talking to various colleges, college presidents, admissions teams to say like, hey, this is what we're doing. Here's why we think it's important. Here's the research that we're doing on it. what do you think as a college? Like, do you think that like the way that we're framing student learning would make sense? Would it prepare kids to do well on your campus and beyond, of course? I just so happen to have a bunch of these quotes from different college presidents and admissions agents. I'll read one though. From Tufts, which is an amazing university outside of Boston, the director of admissions says, quote, "Students typically don't know how to ask a good question. Coming to college would that be really helpful? The rock star students at Tufts are those that know how to ask a question and do research early." Every person that we talked to said some version of that, which means that like, as we think about each one of the stories of our kids and then the work that our teachers were sharing about all of the inquiry, the research that went behind and the presentation of that work, our kids are so ready, our students are so ready to jump into the independence of college thinking and learning and scholarly work. In terms of like how well they're prepared to do on standardized tests, I mean, we're still giving tests and quizzes. I think in terms of that sort of, it doesn't require as much thinking and analytical thought to be able to answer those questions. So as long as they have familiarity and practice with doing them, the types of thinking that we're doing far exceeds that which would prepare them to do well in the tests. You can look on our website and our college profile, the information is there. Our kids are doing well on all of those metrics. And when kids, most importantly, when kids come back to campus after being on a college campus, what impresses me over and over again is students talking about how centered they are in terms of their interests, that they were able to step onto a college campus without as much support as you might have in a high school. And they had that sort of disposition and spirit to know, what am I curious about? How am I going to learn that? And how do I find the support and the peers to push me and encourage me in that area? So our kids are finding that the program works incredibly well.
Can I add something quickly to that? So as someone who's like starting the college admissions process now, like being able to look back at all of the projects and stuff that I've done at my time here, like, is so awesome. And like, there's so many great things that I've done here that I can add into my application that people from other schools, I imagine, probably don't have.
Oliver, you said in far fewer words a much more important thing than what I said. But maybe just to elevate that a little bit. I mean, colleges are so less focused on what courses you took and are more interested in what can you do. And when we have just a plethora of examples of really, as Oliver said, like very clear moments of student-driven inquiry that we can draw on, the letters that we're sending out about our students and their learning, I mean, it's so clear that the kid is known, it's so clear of their strengths, and it's so clear of their sort of unique interests. It becomes much more than just, these are the classes that I took. Thanks for sharing that, Oliver.
Yeah, Oliver, thanks so much. And Mike, you as well. To all of you, that exhausts our questions for now. Thank you so much for taking time out of your night and out of your winter break. I hope the rest of it is restful and safe. And I look forward to seeing you all back here in January. To our viewers, thanks so much and have a good night.
Thank you.